Hi, my name is Jason Courtemanche, and welcome to Mastering Autodesk Vault, Setup and Optimization. One of the first things we want to think about in Vault is setting up categories. So in Vault, there's file categories, item categories. We'll get into it all. The reason why we want to set up file categories and how we can tell if a file has file categories is this icon right here. And we can see when we select an object in Vault, we can see in the Properties panel the category name, and it's denoted by this color. And if we hover over it, we can see what it is. The reason why we want to set up file categories is because the file categories automates a lot of settings automatically when we add new files into Vault. Some examples of things that we can automate with file category is auto assigning a lifecycle, revision schemes, and user-defined properties. And so the way that we go and take a look to see how the Vault's currently set up is we just do Tools Administration, Vault Settings. Then we come over here to the Behaviors tab, click on Categories, and then it might default to something else, but the first thing we want to do is come to the drop-down and make sure we're on File Category. And this shows us all the categories that we have listed in Vault. So we can see, for example, we have an engineering category. Doesn't matter what the name is, we can name it whatever we want, but it makes sense to have one for liked files. So CAD files, we call it engineering, having Office, one for Office files. And the reason why we have categories is that we can down here, we can assign different lifecycle definitions by just clicking assign. And we can see on the left, we see the whole list of available life cycles that we've been created. Some of these are out of the box. And if we wanted to add, a new one, we can just click it over. Whichever one has the check mark, that's the one that is going to be the default. So if I just double click, the most important thing is that we make sure that these are set up ahead of time, because this will save engineers a lot of time. So we can assign life cycles, we can assign different revision schemes, and we can assign user-defined properties. And the reason this is important is that when we add a new file to Vault, so let's say I'll add this file. So we're going to add this simple model to Vault. We'll just check it in. And so as soon as I click check in, we want to make sure that we get the drawing. And so this is a fun button that auto grabs the drawings that are associated to this assembly. Okay, so we check in the file. As soon as I check in the files are going to leave my computer, go over the internet, be checked into Vault. As soon as they get added to Vault, Vault's going to auto assign the category to the files if we have an assignment rule created. So we check it in, we'll refresh, we'll come over here. Come over to the tuners, and we can see right now that this file was brought in on the base category, and that's because we have not created a assignment rule. And so the way that we create an assignment rule is coming back into behaviors, and we click on rules, and we come down to file rules. And in here we can see that right now this Vault's set up to basically only assign files to the base category or to this design representation category. So if I wanted to automatically have all CAD files added to the engineering file category, I would just click new, we'll call it CAD. We want CAD files to be assigned to engineering, we'll click OK. A reminder that these rules are basically evaluated top down. And so we want inventor files. And so we can use one of these properties. Now there is a file extension property, but then we'd have to lift out all 5 or 4 file extensions. I prefer to use a system property called provider, because Vault knows that these are inventor files. So we just do type the word inventor, we can click OK. And so now any file that has the system property provider contains inventor will automatically get assigned this particular file category. This only affects new files added to Vault. Since this file was already checked in, it's not going to, the rule's not going to apply to this file. But I can manually change the category for a particular file by either coming in here and selecting the category I want, or I can test the rule by coming all the way to the bottom and apply by assignment rules. And I recommend doing this just to make sure that the rules work. And so we can see that as soon as I clicked assign by rule, it auto assigned all of these files. A tip is to make sure that include dependents is checked. This way that we're applying the category rule to all files and not just the parent file. And so as soon as I click OK, the category will change, and then all these files will inherit the lifecycle settings, the revision scheme, and the user-defined properties. So I click OK. In Vault, anytime we make a change to a file, we're going to bump the version because Vault tracks everything that gets changed. So now we can see that the file category is engineering. You got to assign the right lifecycle definition. You got to assign the right revision scheme, the right starting rev number, and we can see that we have all of the default user-defined properties that are assigned to the engineering category. And this is the reason why you want to configure categories in Vault, is because it auto assigns all these settings so they don't get missed, and then the end users don't have to spend time remembering to go and manually add all those settings to every file individually. It's a good idea to remember when we're thinking about creating file categories is to think about, I kind of think of the files in terms of like files. So all engineering files, are going to be controlled by the same life cycle. So it makes sense to make a rule for that. If you have files, let's say like Word, Excel files that you don't want to be controlled by a life cycle, it's good to make and configure another file category like the Office one. So if we come back to the categories, we can see that there's an Office category already created, and we can see, we can make any changes that we want in terms of color or the name if we need to. But if we know that we don't want to have a lifecycle controlling Office files, we can come in here, click assign. We can make sure none is the default, and then we can remove all of these other lifecycles definitions. And this way, no lifecycle will be assigned, and we can't accidentally change it to something else. The same thing about revision information. If we don't need revision information for this kind of file type, we can set it to none. And it's always good to also check the properties, because not all files have metadata. So in this case, we can see that this property list is quite a bit less than the one that we had on the engineering file, and that makes sense because the amount of metadata in an inventor file is different than the amount of metadata that's in, like, let's say, a Word file. And so we can basically add or remove properties as needed. So if we know that we don't use the keyword and don't need an approver, then we can kind of fine-tune the properties. And the reason why this is important is because if we don't fine-tune the file categories, so if I come back to like for instance, this particular text file, it got changed to an Office category, but it already had all of these particular properties assigned to it. We could manually remove properties, but I wouldn't want to come in here and have to come in here and try to remove every property I don't need for every single file. And this is where the power of the file categories come into hand, is that it allows us to set a standard and make sure that all files get assigned the correct category and in turn inherit the correct lifecycle information, the correct revision information, and along with the correct metadata. Having the properties in Vault help us find and reuse content, and the file properties help us make sure that the correct file types are getting the correct metadata. One thing to note about when creating file lifecycle rules is that we want to be very careful when we create the rules, and that we'll make sure that we're not getting extra files. And what I mean by that is, if we go back to the tuner, I'm going to delete this out of Vault, so we're going to put it back so that we can test the auto check-in feature to make sure that the rules applying on check-in. Okay, so we'll check the file back in. We'll make sure we have the drawing file. And so on check-in, it should be auto applying the rules, because the rules only apply on the first time you check a file in. And so if we come here to tuner, we can see now it's automatically getting the engineering category, and we can confirm that because of the color icon. We can confirm that because of the category name, and that's all because of the assignment rule is basically using this system property provider, because Vault knows that this is an inventor file, and so it's far easier to use this property than something else. The other thing we want to check is when we create files in Vault, there's a hidden visualization file, which is what gets created here, either on check-in or we can manually do it. But this view works because of a hidden file, which we'll see in a moment. And so it's important when we're creating file lifecycle rules that we're not accidentally assigning the engineering category to these hidden files. So if we just come to Tools, Options, we can click this button called Show Hidden Files, and we want to confirm. So in this case, it's working out perfect, because we do not want to add a lifecycle to these hidden DWF files. And so one of the things that I like to do sometimes is to add this rule to the assignment rules. So if we come now into rules, we can see we have provider contains engineer, or contains inventor. But we can add other rules. So if we come here, we can select. So we know that visualization files are classified as design visualizations. So if we come here to classification, is not design visualization file. So all the rules down here are treated as an and. So it's provider contains inventor and classification is not designed visualization file. And so this is just a good way to know for sure that we're not going to get the design visualization files assigned to a lifecycle. So in Vault, there's file-based lifecycles and there are item-based lifecycles. File-based lifecycles pertain to files in Vault. So these CAD files, whether it's CAD files, Word, all of those are controlled by file-based lifecycles. In Vault, we have things that are called items. We'll get into what they are in a moment, but it's good to know that file-based lifecycles and items are different, but they do the same function. The file-based category and item-based category controls the same things. It auto-assigns a lifecycle to an object, a revision scheme, and the properties. So item-based categories basically control these settings for items. The file-based category controls these settings for files. And as you can see from the list, you can actually also set up folder categories which is the same thing in terms if you wanted to assign a lifecycle or properties to a folder. It's all contained within this one dialog box. So for me to show you item-based categories, we need to first turn off the rule that we created, because in Vault we want to either assign files to file-based lifecycle or to item-based lifecycle. We do not want a file to be assigned to two different types of lifecycles. And so in that case, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to remove this particular rule because I don't want to automatically assign. There's two things I can do. I can either remove this rule, or I can change the category settings, because maybe we still want, I can change the category settings by coming in here and removing and just setting this to none, setting the file-based revision scheme to none. This way, because we still need to assign properties to files, but I don't want file-based lifecycles or file-based revision, and so I put these to none. Now we can go back to Inventor. We can find a different sample model. Okay, so we basically open up a sample assembly. So this time now when I check this file into Vault, and let's make sure we get the drawings, it's going to be assigned the file category engineering, but it will not get any file-based lifecycle or revision scheme. And then that way we can still capture the metadata or control which metadata fields are applied to all of these Inventor files. Okay, so now that we've checked everything, we will refresh. We can see that we have the test station in here. We can see that engineering files were assigned to engineering. Things like JPEG files are assigned to base, and that's because of the assignment rules, that there's a no file-based category for JPEG. We can see that only basically evaluates the rules from the top down. So there's no design representation files. This would be PDFs created by a job processor. Only engineering Inventor files go to the engineering. All other file extensions go to the base category. And so that's why we get these two different categories. Now that the file's in Vault, and we want to create an item so if I just right mouse click, actually, let's look at a setting. So I can create an item, but if I'm going to create an item, I want to create an item for all of the children. So let's just make sure that I am creating, okay, great, all. So this is what I wanted to make sure that it's set to all, because this means that I can create this item for the top level assembly, and it will create items for all of the children as well. And as the items are created, they're getting evaluated by item rules, and so we can see that this particular item got assigned the assembly category, which makes sense because this particular item was created from an assembly file. And because I had that option to create items for all of the children, if we click on the Build Material tab, we can see that there's been an item number and an item created for all of the child parts. And we can see that the item category assigned a lifecycle scheme, which assigned the starting lifecycle definition of work in progress. It assigned the revision scheme. At this point, I'll just exit and save. And now that we have some items in the item category, let's go and take a look. So if I just right mouse click and select go to item, we'll see down here, it'll take me to the item workplace. And so now I can see the item themselves, the title, the revision, and the state. It's good to know that essentially an item, think of it as like a digital folder. So this particular item, if I click on it, is a folder. The folder has a number and a title and potentially a description. And inside this folder, we are basically containing this particular CAT file. And so the big difference is that items, the metadata and the lifecycle is assigned to the item, and the item is a container that holds files, and we can see which files are in this particular item, which is different from file-based category and file-based lifecycle, where the lifecycle and the revision is assigned to the file itself. And so that's kind of the big difference. So now that we have items created, let's go back here to the categories and explore the item categories. So let's go back to the categories and look at the item categories. And so if you're not on it, we can just select it. So these are the out-of-the-box categories. You can see that the default one's document. So inventor assembly files, when you create an item from assembly file, the item contains the assembly, and then Vault knows to assign the item category to assembly. Just like we'll see in a moment that all the part files were assigned to this part category. So depending on which item category files get assigned to, then they inherit the settings, the lifecycle settings. So all of these files inherit the item release process, the standard alpha format for revision schemes, and then this particular property, which is needed because this is the property that basically tells the item what the item number is. It basically is linked to the part number inside the file. So whatever the part number is inside of Inventor, that's what will drive the part, or will drive the item number so that they're the same. So we go back to the item. Oh, so if we can see, that's the other thing, is because there's no icon here, there's no items associated. If I go back to the test station, the easiest way to tell if an item's been created for a file is that this little icon will be here. And then if I want to so if any file that has this particular icon, it means that there's an item assigned to it, which means if I right mouse click to it, I can either go to the item or just open the item up to view. And so if I open it up, I basically get this item window where I can see what the category is. And if I go to the history tab, I can see what the revision is for this particular item. So how do we choose between file-based lifecycle and item lifecycle, or items? And the most important thing to know, or the biggest difference between these two, is if I open up an item, we can see that they both have a lifecycle, they both have a revision scheme. The difference is that the lifecycle and revision scheme on an item is attached to the item itself, not the individual files. And what makes items different than files is that items have bill of material information. And so all of the child component gets its own item and generates, a quantity information. And so usually the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, the data that I'm saving in Vault, does it have a bill of material information? And things like Inventor, AutoCAD Mechanical, applications like that generate CAD files that have BOM information. And so if you're managing BOM or files with BOM information, then you'd probably lean towards item-based, an item-based lifecycle. One of the drawbacks to item-based lifecycles is that you can't take advantage of some of the file lifecycle features, like using the job processor. to create PDFs or update visualization files. So there's some subtle differences. But the first question you have to ask yourself is, the files that I'm trying to control by lifecycle, does it have BOM information? If it does, then it might be worth looking into items. If it does not, then you're automatically going to use file-based lifecycle or no lifecycle. It just depends on the workflow.